Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Swithin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss, should public intellectuals be more like Ric Flair? Tim.
So again, we're joined by Terminal Philosophy to discuss, to some extent, extenuation of our Alex Jones and Graham Hancock episode, and to some extent, our Errors of History podcast episode we did 3 months or 6 months ago. And Alex Jones and Graham Hancock are two sort of popular intellectuals who sort of have almost WWE mentality, and who, of course, is more pro wrestler, WWF, WWE. I could use the terms interchangeably here. Who's more of a wrestler's wrestler than Ric Flair? Ric Flair is, if you ask someone like The Undertaker or Shawn Michaels or The Rock, who's their favorite wrestler growing up or who's an inspiration to them, it's probably Ric Flair, funnily enough. Ric Flair, ESPN did a documentary on him. You see his name sort of in the culture. He tried to run for office supposedly too. The woo chant is out there as well. So recently, what made me think of this idea? Well, recently I saw an Israeli doctor or an epidemiologist who came out against, I'm not sure if it was the vaccines and lockdown or just the lockdown. And I was reading his article, and it was a polemic basically. And I was thinking, wouldn't it be better if Ric Flair read this in Ric Flair's mentality? Because Ric Flair back in the day was somewhat of a villain that everyone liked. He'd go up against guys like Dusty Rhodes. So you have this sort of guy wearing like silk suits, and going into wrestling's like a low, working class type entertainment, especially back in the day. And Ric Flair would show up in gator skin, like shoes and all sorts of watches, and he sort of lived the lifestyle as a kind of playboy. Now, someone that was an act, but someone that wasn't an act. So back to the Israeli doctor point, I was thinking, wouldn't it be better if he said this in that mentality? And TP on the recent episode said that Alex Jones is a brand, somewhat of a brand, and everyone knows he's sort of a showman. And wrestling is a show. It's sort of like a fake and real show. Wink, wink at the same time. So it's sort of an interesting sport. And as Eric Bischoff pointed out, the news media at times is operating from the WWE playbook. I mean, the yelling, the promos. You should watch Donald Trump. That's actually one of the first time I, as a kid, heard of Donald Trump was on WrestleMania. I watched that live, where he had a wrestling match with they had hired, quote unquote, hired people as stand-ins, but actually Trump and McMahon got into a match on the side of the ring at one point. Vince, he got clotheslined he gave Vince a clothesline. So what my point is here, I think certain intellectuals are already becoming like showmen. Nassim Taleb's been doing this for years. Glenn Greenwald does this. Sam Harris kind of has like a brand almost. Well, Christopher Hitchens has a brand. I would argue Chomsky has a brand. Now, the question is, should they keep going with this mentality? Because one of the ingeniouses of Vince McMahon in wrestling is the sort of branding of it and the sort of turning into a cultural meme. Like the Hoppian people, the Hoppian memes have sort of become a thing. And, where does it come from? I think in the past, I was reading a book on R.C. Sproul and the Reformation, and he was saying like Luther's would call his opponents dogs. So I don't think it's, and there used to be more dueling as well. So I don't think it came out of nowhere here. So my first question to both of you is, to me, it's already happening. The question is, should we cheer this on, so to speak, like wrestling fans, or should we, bemoan it? Do you think? First of all, do you agree that the sort of pro-wrestlification of intellectuals and academia is happening? I would think you, to some extent, agree. And what do you make of this? TP, thanks for being on again.
Right. Well, thanks for having me once again. Well, yes, actually, in short, I think intellectuals should be more like Ric Flair. And let me explain myself. I think it's a bit more relatable that thinkers bring themselves down a notch or two in terms of seriousness. I actually think it tends to make the red meat of an idea more accessible to the average person, because public intellectuals, regardless of their degree to which they influence the public, that's what they're out there to do. They're there to influence the public and to carry out their vision, their political or social vision on the world. I think gregariousness is actually a sorely missing element to modern intellectual life. You both, as well as your listeners, may recall that, of the early days of blood sports, and I mean, blood sports in a certain way, it never really went away. Blood sports really served as a sort of prototype to the archetype of the debate bro. Tim, what you said earlier, in the sense that, Hoppe and others have their own brand to maintain. I think Chomsky is probably the one who could possibly be removed from that, because he is sort of the image of an old intellectual that most people have in their heads, where, it's a guy wearing a sweater vest and going on for a long time about a certain niche, complex topic. Now, of course, somewhere between Chomsky and the tanky infrared, surely there's a middle ground that people can reach for. But I think when people watch a debate between, say, someone like Bosch and someone from the alt-right, or anyone really, I sometimes think that people aren't necessarily there to be persuaded of one idea or another, the merits. They're there for a crafty mudslinging. I think the desire to seem crafty amongst YouTube debaters is very high, and so that craftiness often comes across as as sort of a brand unto itself, which can come across like the persona of a professional wrestler. Now, where I think professional wrestling could be less, I guess, used in the public is mainstream media, because A, they don't do it very well, and B, it actually has negative consequences for the public, and especially during elections and things like that. I think I've repeated this on our last episode, but I'll just repeat it here quickly, just for a summary. The format of mainstream media is something like, okay, so we just finished up watching a Doritos commercial, and now we're watching Rachel Maddow's Adam's apple bob up and down aggressively for 5 minutes about some ostensibly woke topic, and then she'll bring on a sparring debate partner, and they'll both interrupt each other for a very short amount of time, for about 2 or 3 or 4 minutes, and then they'll cut to a Mountain Dew commercial. So that format itself makes digesting intellectual topics and topics in the humanities in general very, very difficult, especially for the average person. If you're a blue-collar guy or gal from the Midwest and you fabricate metal and you're trying to wrap your head around the the finer points of something like election fraud, or voter fraud, or Vladimir Putin invading Ukraine, or what have you. So, however, I think intellectualism, if you can call it that, is more consistently explored by the public on places like YouTube and just video platforms like that. And because it's not the mainstream format, you get to listen to something for a sustained period of time. And so that's where the craft, if you want to call it that, of the persona of a wrestler or of a large cult of personality type of a person could come out. But it's not going to happen on mainstream media. So I'll leave my first answer at that.
I would say I'm broad agreement again that I do think intellectuals should be more like Ric Flair. So taking it to a slightly different place, if you look at the way sort of academic articles are written, and sort of the culture that's engendered in sort of like in journals and things like that, basically any sort of witty or sort of well-written prose is essentially considered unscholarly, and the way to be scholarly is to be as dull as possible, without any sort of wit or humor or anything. It's just sort of not there. As an aside, Hans Hoppe does do this. In one of his essays, I think it's one of his journal articles on in defense of extreme rationalism. It was entitled, I think it was Against the Rhetoric of Economics, Donald McCloskey's Rhetoric of Economics. I think it's that paper. It has a footnote that says, I don't know what the world looks like on LSD, unlike Don Lavoie. I've never seen that in any other one before, just ripping another guy in a journal article for being on LSD, which I thought was pretty funny. So I think you have a weird sort of disjunct in sort of popular, as I say, like the news media stuff and like academia, and there's no real sort of middle ground, which is kind of like vaguely entertaining and also in depth. And I think TP's right. I mean, if you're trying to engage like average people who aren't particularly autistes or particularly interested in a certain topic, you kind of need to be quite charismatic to engage people. I mean, so for one thing, if I'm just going around YouTube and I see, oh, there's another Zizek video, I'm much more inclined to watch a Zizek video than many others because Zizek's funny. And that's me, and I'm really not representative of most people. And if I'm much more likely to watch a Zizek video because I know he's funny, I mean, that's going to increase the amount of time other people are going to watch a video like that, knowing that he's quite entertaining. So having these sort of brands is good. I mean, obviously the problem with just getting into mudslinging is kind of be an issue. But I think if you have a situation where you can have people who are entertaining and this can hold people's attention in longer formats, this is all for the better. And on the side with that, although interestingly he isn't necessarily hugely entertaining most of the time, that's where, for instance, Joe Rogan does well. I mean, who'd have thought you'd be able to get like teenage boys to listen to 3 hours of an interview with somebody? That isn't what you would typically have expected. So in general, yeah, Ric Flair for the win.
Great. So now Ric Flair is one type of wrestler, and I think you could have other wrestlers. I think different intellectuals look at after different. You could be more like The Undertaker, more like Triple H, or more like Steve Austin. You know, you don't have to be like Ric Flair, but I think Ric Flair is interesting because he is sort of like he's a very confident individual, and he's very famous for his promos. And Paul Gottfried, he runs, I think it's the I forget what journal he runs, some review of books, and he said he wants to keep the tone polemic in nature rather than dry. And the reason he wants to keep it so to keep people interested. He said we don't represent the mainstream, we don't represent conservative. We want to be edgy, and we want to push things. So that's so. And Peter Hitchens, I think he said this, I think, in an interview once that. Or his column, that when he goes to debate someone like on marriage or whatever topic, he knows in a way that he's the villain, that he's entering the room. And actually, he was asked about why he stopped debating his brother, because he said he didn't want to make it a dog and pony show, so to speak. So I do think intellectuals know to some extent it's more self-conscious that they are, in a way, brands to something. And Zizek is extremely interesting because he knows that too, that he's somewhat of a, he does film reviews, he has a lot of popular work, and he went after Chomsky as well. He said I've never heard of someone who's more empirically incorrect more often than Chomsky. He was almost like a rap diss, almost going back and forth. And I think Chomsky's response was, "What theory?" So that sort of playback was interesting, and the Hoppe article, that's hilarious as well. So yeah, the mudslinging is interesting, and I think it does go back further into the past than people on certain topics, and than some of the more the people who sort of disdain this. But in a way, we've entered the sort of media culture now, and we can't really come back from that. So the first question for both of you, should it happen? Should it happen? I mean, the boring answer is to say it shouldn't. We should just focus on the arguments here. Even if one is saying there is no knowledge, or so what's interesting to me about, let me backtrack. What's interesting to me about Ric Flair is his confidence here. And that's one of the things I think is interesting. So to take a look more like Robert Malone. What Robert Malone is doing in that 3-hour interview with Joe Rogan on Spotify is sort of interesting, and so is heroic in a way, because he's going after a huge body of power elites, authorities, and so forth. I mean, the amount of confidence it takes to do that is quite is quite incredible. And we brought up Graham Hancock we did like a month ago. He's another guy that's going up against a very entrenched elite, intellectual elite, of course, in his case. And then, people like Alex Jones who question 9/11 or question other topics. He's, again, to say that you think the mainstream is wrong, which is what I think what goes back to Paul Gottfried's point about, I think it's the review of books or something like that. I can't think of the name. You sort of want to keep it polemic, but also to even advance those things, to a certain extent, you have to be sort of out there in confidence, like Ric Flair. So how much should this matter here for both of you? Do you think it should matter a lot? Do you think it should matter nothing at all? To me, I made a comment here. Socrates going to Athens, he may as well be wearing a gold ring and flashy coat, like saying, "Look, I'm here. I'm going to take the punishment here. I want to take the punishment. You should put me up in a hotel." I think his basic line was, "You should pay me to teach all your children." I think was roughly the line he did in the Plato's Apology or something like, or the Trial of Socrates. So I think that kind of beef mentality that you see with Ric Flair goes back much farther. And as Peter Hitchens points out with Christ, he has throwbacks that are, he'll make fun of his opponents when asked from time to time. So I think it matters somewhat. Maybe we shouldn't go all the way, but I definitely think it's going that way, even if we choose not to. So TP, what would you say about my comments? How much should the persona matter to one's argument? And how much is this related to just a simple ad hominem argument as well? That's, I think, a point that also have to be brought up. But, you could say, well, that's a bad character, therefore the argument's false. That's also a problem. This is a good character. It might also be a problem there too. So what do you make of that first sort of a comment and a question there, TP?
Yes, overall, I think it's fine to bring a certain element of gregariousness to a debate. I think the way in which an argument is delivered is arguably, anywhere from a third to half of the overall pie chart of how much attitude and persona is to be brought to a debate in the first place. The reason why I say that is because what Swithin said earlier is basically a good summary of that. When you are sort of perusing the internet for something history or politically related or something in the humanities, I guess you don't want to hear someone who is, really boring and dull delivering it. You want someone with, a certain personality. And, maybe gregariousness isn't the best way to describe that, but, when someone detects a personality, but they're also well-read in either the Western canon or humanities in general, well, it just makes the overall package, when that intellectual is attempting to persuade you of something, it makes it more relatable and simply just easier to digest. That's not to say that there's not a place in the world for the drier intellectual types. I think the one thing that helps the dry intellectual types save them from obscurity is if their craft is exceptionally good. So as long as that's there, or as long as they have some type of originality on their own ideas or on a political theory or something like that, or they have a unique way of analyzing something, I think that's fine. But typically the public favors someone with a personality and with a little bit of something combustible going on, rather than just sort of again, maybe this is a bad way of maybe this is a bad comparison, but someone not like Chomsky is typically preferred, because Chomsky is sort of like the C-SPAN 65 and older C-SPAN demographic is the best way I can describe him. But Zizek, with his debates in Jordan Peterson, he almost kind of plays with Jordan Peterson and his witty comments either about Hegel or Marx or the early psychiatrists of the 20th century and so on and so forth. He's kind of there to have fun because, he knows that he's sort of the villain too, because I think the way the public perceives Jordan Peterson is like this up-and-coming sort of self-help guru who's the good guy against the mean old Marxist, where it's hard to describe. It's hard to think of Zizek in that way because he's not a Marxist, I would say, in the textbook sense. He's kind of more of a I don't know. He always struck me more as of a Hegelian than he did just a textbook Marxist. But he's also really funny and witty, and that's kind of why people like to watch him, because he has both the ability to recall a lot of interesting ideas and theories in political science, and is just a great curator of the humanities. And he's got a funny way of doing it, whereas sometimes Jordan Peterson may attempt or ends up coming across too seriously to people in trying, in the name of slaying evil or something like that. So, and maybe I'm projecting my desires on reality there in that analysis, but that does seem to be the overall gestalt of things between those two. But I would say the degree to which a persona should be present in debates or in promoting ideas, it's anywhere from a third to a half at least, because again, you want people are kind of looking for that Julius Caesar kind of General Patton kind of a personality to go along with good ideas in terms of the humanities in general.
I think your comparison with Peterson and Zizek is interesting. I remember listening to the debate on communism, the communism debate. I think Zizek clearly wins, I think, as sort of on technical matters, although Zizek is hugely sly at the same time, because he basically doesn't defend communism. He defends a variant of welfare state capitalism, because and this is, I think, one aspect of certain intellectuals and why they're poor in debates and why I don't think they communicate hugely well to certain audiences is they're not streetwise enough. I don't know if Peterson did his homework on Zizek, but Peterson starts out the debate by basically going, well, this is what the Communist Manifesto says, and that's stupid. Zizek's a commie, so I must believe that. And then Zizek goes, well, you have to be a communist to believe that. I mean, there's new forms of Marxism. And this completely sidesteps everything he said in his opening statement, which is kind of entertaining and kind of sly in its own right. And so you do need some sort of streetwise aspect to this sort of debaters. I think TP's right when he mentions you can get away with being boring and dry if you're original. But the thing is, so few people are original in any real meaningful way that really do want to sort of amp up the sort of the interest. I mean, what's kind of odd in a certain way is that you'd think that politicians would try to engender great sort of cults of personality so they get elected. But almost all politicians are so dull. And they're sort of like hugely stage managed so that, well, it seems to be the case that politicians these days try to go through an interview without making a mistake rather than actually being interesting or saying of anything of note, which I suppose maybe some of the dispositions of some of the intellectuals, the sort of, as it were, those of less wrong mentality. So when it comes to sort of like persona, should that matter really in the debate? Well, it depends what you want to get out of the debate. I mean, if you do have a formal debate, it is sort of like a verbal punch-up. And so in that respect, if you know that going in, then I think that's perfectly fine. I think the problem occurs when debate as spectacle and also ideas as well overtakes the ideas themselves, and then means that people kind of hold the views for the wrong reasons or therefore hold the wrong ones because the guy they happen to like who is more sort of charismatic, oh yeah, he's obviously right. Because the interesting thing when you listen to debates is or possibly the most not the most interesting ones, are ones where you disagree with both of the debaters. But then the reason that's interesting is because you can then more easily tell who wins on sort of on technical grounds. So sort of theology debate. I remember listening to Doug Wilson arguing for Calvinism versus some Arminian. And I was like, well, I don't actually hold either of your positions on this sort of theology. And so it's actually, you can actually just tell on sort of like technicality who wins. And Doug Wilson clearly won on technicality. But that's the issue. And I suppose then moving away from debates, and I think I mentioned this last time, in many cases, formal debates aren't actually that interesting. Now, it depends who the participants are. But unless you've got particularly charismatic people, formal debates can be very uninteresting because you spend most of the time not disagreeing with anybody. You keep going through all your formal statements and stuff. And so actually more like a moderated discussion is probably more interesting potentially for ideas. Now, whether it would appeal to people as much on spectacle is another question. Although it would be interesting, for instance, to have a rerun of the Peterson Zizek one, but as more of a moderated discussion than as a formal debate. That would be interesting. So, yeah, I'm for spectacle. Just got to make sure that people realize that debate isn't the end of investigation into ideas.
One of the things I think Swith and I, we have a few disagreements. I think one of the things that Swith and I disagree with is on debates here. Recently, I might say the name right, Kinsella debated a defender of IP, Epstein, Richard Epstein. Yeah, Richard Epstein. And I thought it was a quite interesting debate. Now, he didn't think, I think Swithin's criticism was that, well, they should have just argued like ships in the night, I think, or something like that. And a lot of people say that about the sort of famous Foucault-Chomsky debate as well. They didn't really engage each other. They sort of just, I think Kinsella just said, we just had all this empirical arguments. But I thought it was quite interesting because it sort of laid out two competing arguments here. I also saw a Soho forum debate on lockdowns. And this was, I think, was a good. The lady there. This is where I was full. I think was whoever decided this was a very tactical move here because I think again optics matter. And they brought a woman to do the argue against the vaccine mandate. And she just egged on the opponent about every single issue. Like she was very good. She might not have won on points, ground, or theoretic philosophy, but she was just throwing mud at the opponent the whole time, basically, in comments, and she didn't take any crap either. So I thought she did very well against the opponent who was arguing in favor of vaccine mandate. It was just like, this is an emergency. And she was like, no, it's not. This is nonsense. And I thought she did a very good job. Because I think to some extent, one of the purposes of debate is to sort of humiliate your opponent. I think at times should be at least one of the goals here. Because ultimately, if you hold a wrong view or hold a view that you think is evil, at some point, you have to sort of ask you, why does that person hold the view? I think Alex Jones also thinks that. And that can be a turn on and a put off, of course, if you just want, intellectual exchanges of ideas. So like on the issue of IP, for example, like I more or less think Kinsella has the correct view. But it was interesting to see that someone tried to defend the incorrect view about and I thought Epstein did as good of a job as he could with a difficult position here. Because it's hard to defend that monopoly here. But even Epstein, he has a podcast. I used to listen to it more back when I was more of a minarchist of some variety. Speaking of, and he's somewhat of a brand, not a very big one, but he is somewhat of a brand there. And another debate that me and Swithin both watched is the Kinsella versus Jan Helfeld debates, which are certainly legendary in just hilariousness. Because again, it is a bit of a scream fest in a sense. Not that screaming like screaming, but like it's quite nasty in a way. Kinsella was just saying this is aggression. So these are debates I've seen that have sort of a blood sport, mentality here. But I find that interesting, and you pick up interesting tidbits along the way. I don't see that as a problem here. I think the sort of dramatizing things in a way is more interesting, and I think it's more passionate as well. I think that's something that's sometimes missing. You brought up that Doug Wilson debate. I think the speakers that tend to have passion, even when they lose in a way like Ric Flair would lose. They sort of lose in sort of this bombastic way. Speaking of losing into my speak, Nassim Taleb, who I liked a lot. I mean, I read all his books. He was very pro-lockdown, very pro-vaccine mandate. I'll give him credit. He's been extremely consistent early on. Like he was double masking 2 years ago before everyone else did it. So like even the villains I see, in the same way with Zizek, certain issues I view Zizek as a villain, of course, being a sort of pure capitalist of some variety. But I have to view him as a villain in certain ways. At least he's sort of pure and out there. He's not like some of the moderates. Sometimes they hold sort of like this sort of wishy-washy, compromise position to try to make everyone happy, which you don't always see. So that's to me the upside of the Ric Flair mentality. That's to me upsides. So if you guys want to comment on that, you can go ahead. Then we'll sort of get into the downsides here. I do think there are downsides here. So if you guys want to comment on that, and then our final section will be on the downsides, of course. If you want to get into that, go ahead. TP?
Yeah, the one comment I was going to say is that, on the other side of the spectrum, which you mentioned earlier, Tim, was the Foucault-Chomsky debates of, I think, what was that, sometime in the 1970s, I think. I think one thing, I haven't seen that in a few years, but one thing I do remember Chomsky saying is that, well, Foucault, your ideas are inaccessible because you write so abstractly. I mean, that was kind of like that's really the one rap diss that I can remember, if you can even call it that. But they weren't really debating each other directly. They were kind of more discussing their own ideas, and I think it was a debate on human nature. I think, forgive me if I'm wrong on the debate topic, but you kind of have that example at the other end where it's just so dry and it's so inaccessible that you don't have very many people to win over or any sort of public policy to directly influence from the beginning, because you're just dealing in such theoretical niche topics that are very they're made inaccessible by the difficulty of the subject and also by the rigidness and sort of ungregarious personalities of the interlocutors. So yes, that can that can make it difficult to popularize an idea or a certain type of analysis on a topic related to humanities. That's the only thing I was going to say about that before we go to the downsides of Ric Flairism.
All I say is I listened to the Chomsky Foucault debate a while ago, but oddly I remember it being reasonably interesting and probably more interesting than the Richard Epstein Stephen Kinsella one. Although I suppose because I knew the background to Kinsella and Epstein much more than I did from Foucault's approach and Chomsky's, so I suppose I was learning more from that. So I actually quite like that one, oddly. That's all I've really got to add there, I think, before we hit the downsides.
Okay, great. Well, so the final section here will be on the downsides. And the downsides, to me, I think there's a few of them. First of all, of course, it obviously distracts from the intellectual arguments here. That's quite obvious here. So, like, if you wrote this down, if you wrote it down and had it read in 100 years, does it still make sense? Is it still relevant? Is it still worthy to read? I mean, if it passes that test, I think, then yes, it still works. As dry as some of on the few long plane rides I was on in the past, I used to try to read Thomas Aquinas. I had it saved on my Kindle. I would read Thomas Aquinas. It's free. theology. I forget which book it is. There's a couple of them. I just try to go through the points. I try to read like 20 points an hour or something like that. Again, I don't know how much I picked up, but I think it's sort of a worthy thing to try to do. So like people, David Friedman would say, oh, we still read Aristotle, or we still read, I don't know, Zeno, or we still read Socrates. So I think if it lasts a long time, will it last a long time? That's a good question here. But then again, some of those writers are also quite entertaining in a way, or clear. So I think having too much persona obviously distracts from it, and it's also a way to funnel ideas, which, if there is such thing as if there's such thing as non-truth or incorrect arguments, or whatever you want to say here, I don't want to make a epistemology argument here whether it exists or not. If you have a charismatic person, they can make arguments that are untrue very well. All right, that's quite obvious here. So that's one thing. I'd say that's, if I really want to sort the downsides, is if it's an issue I disagree with. Let's say you have a left-wing version of Ric Flair, or like a sort of pro-lockdown, or some pro, I don't know. If you saw, like we recently did the Graham Hancock thing, if you had someone, an Egyptologist, who came on who was actually very charismatic, and make arguments in favor of that, then maybe it's not as interesting. Then maybe I'd be more. Then maybe I wouldn't like it as much. But in a way, the mainstream, I don't think will ever do this. I think, and for structural reason, I think the mainstream won't do this, because in a way, and I think we brought this up in the last episode, institutions sort of have to be more to what I think are called the politics of respectability. So the outsider always, in a way, has to act like this. And a lot of times, currently, we don't have the same politics or world views, but I think we're more outsiders, especially to academia in a lot of ways, at least who's in charge, so to speak. So I do think there are downsides. I think the number one downside is that if you have a thing that's wrong, or thing that's bad, or thing that's incorrect, and that is, being stated, a charismatic Ric Flair type can get away. I don't want to belabor that point. That would be my thing. What would be your thing? Would you agree, TP? And then we pass it just with it.
Now, I'm sorry. Do you mind just restating your question one more time, please? I apologize.
What are the downsides? I've listed what I would view as the primary downside, which is something like the downsides of intellectuals acting like Ric Flair, being overly grandiose, or being overly bellicose. That would be my downsides. Is if you have a false idea or a wrong idea, this, and they're very charismatic. It's not that hard to explain here in that way. That'd be my downside. TP, what would be your downside? And would you agree with me saying that is a big downside?
Right, yeah, that's an interesting point, and I fully agree with you there. You said something interesting earlier, which was that if someone has, if one of the interlocutors has a very sort of exaggerated and bellicose personality, as you put it, then they can still end up being technically wrong in a very sort of artistic sort of way, and I think that is that's actually the problem where what I mentioned earlier, that the mainstream can sort of suffer from. I think they can be wrong about something sort of semi-artistically and in a crafty sort of way, and you can end up persuading the public, or more I don't want to say gullible people, but highly malleable people, of something wrong or potentially immoral. So yes, I think this is at least one of the precise points at which gregariousness, or a sort of over-the-top personality, can become a hindrance in terms of public debates in the humanities. Yes, of course, as with many things in life, there requires a bit of a balancing act. I think first and foremost, if you are someone who's interested in history or philosophy or psychology, or one of these soft sciences, then I think it's important for you to do your homework, so to speak, for several years before you enter a debate, so you're well equipped and you have a good understanding of what's going on. And with these soft sciences, I think there's sort of a interesting fine line between where a person or a debater in these soft sciences, there's this desire to seem crafty. It's difficult where that line starts and where their genuine attempt or their genuine sort of the genuine part of themselves is trying to get across their debate, or get across their side of the argument. And so that can be very difficult to detect depending on how well you are attuned to pick up on that sort of thing. So, yes, I think it requires a balancing act. But, again, if you're too gregarious, I brought up this gentleman earlier, but I imagine you or you gentlemen or a few of your listeners may have listened to the YouTuber Infrared. He's basically a self-described Stalinist tanky. I kind of like him for the sense in that he is over the top, but then he's kind of a two-fisted fighter. On the one hand, he can just be this big, loud, personality that just people go there to watch a screaming match. It's sort of a funny way. Or he can shift gears and he can start rapping Hegel quite clearly. In several debates, he's demonstrated that. So I kind of like that about him. I'm not a Stalinist myself, at least not yet, but I do find that ability to do both at once in sort of a complicated, overlapping kind of a way very I think that's kind of an interesting ability, and I think that would help a lot of people. But now, maybe some people would argue that he's not the best example, and okay, fair enough. But at least I've detected in him some, a good foundation of what you could say Western analytical philosophy, Western history, and then you could maybe throw in a bit of genuine, decent political science and political analysis in there. So that. Whether Infrared or other people are not the best examples, I think what I stated just now is like you want that sort of balance to be achieved.
As you mentioned, Tim, I think that the charlatan who is a charismatic sort of sophist is of course one of the large problems with the big personality stuff. And as I said before, the focus on personality over ideas as well is also a particular issue. I think interesting you brought up Aristotle, because the stuff we have, if my understanding is correct, what we have left of Aristotle is what was written notes by his students. Because from the historical references, Aristotle was apparently supposed to be a very good orator and writer. It's just that we just have the notes from his students, which were somewhat dry. So maybe if we'd actually had original Aristotle, it would be like the Metaphysics, but sort of vaguely entertainingly written, as well as being. It does seem to be a skill that very few people have. For instance, just on writing, this is more than public persona, but it's intellectual to some extent. Edward Fazer is a very good writer as well as being a decent philosopher. Even if you think he's wrong on issues, he's clearly thought about stuff that can make articulate claims. But he's really quite easy to read and sort of, reasonably entertaining. Whereas a lot of sort of philosophy written is sort of turgid and really quite difficult. And I'm not even talking about Derrida or Foucault. I'm just saying it's just clunky and just without sort of it isn't something you could relatively easy read. I'm not saying that scholastic metaphysics is an easy read, but I mean it's a much easier read than it could have been. When it comes to the downside and sort of personality, you're sort of getting onto the idea of the arts, and it reminds me of what Plato says in the Republic, about, we've got to make sure that the artist is sort of like very controlled, otherwise he will send the public astray. Because in a way, being a good sort of stylistic debater or entertaining in a sense is artistic in a sense. I think, did I remember, or someone claimed that Alex Jones, in one of the court cases he had against him, was saying that he was engaged in performance art and you shouldn't necessarily take everything he says seriously. Now, that may have been a misquote or false. Either way, you could very much claim that sort of the style that Jones goes for is almost like performance art as a way. So it's really, you're getting into sort of like, I think, the relationship between sort of like the arts and sort of like the sciences as more broadly conceived. This guy must have been super autiste, but I remember there was a guy on the old Mises forum who limited himself. He limited himself to like one novel a year to maintain and quote epistemic hygiene. This guy was like, I imagine he would prefer all books to be written in symbolic logic. That's the kind of guy he is. But I mean, very few people are going to do that. So yeah, I mean, he's atypical, and I think again, you want to bring it. Actually, it's I think one of the problems with intellectuals is they're so specialized that they have no overtraining in anything else, and therefore can't link things and make interesting connections because they simply don't know anything about any other area. I suppose this is sort of like the bringing out the old call for the old sort of like Renaissance man sort of broad intellectual background, so that you can actually make these sorts of comments. I suspect Zizek is like that to a large extent, actually, as you bring back as one of the good examples of that. And I think that a lot of debaters or a lot of writers, because they're so myopic in their focus, there's literally nothing that they can reference to something else that they actually have know anything about to make their writing or speech interesting. So that's a problem and just a diagnosis, I think, one of the reasons why we are where we are.
As far as Zizek is extremely well read, and he is extremely well read. He quotes Chesterton, he'll quote Socrates, he'll quote all sorts of people. So Zizek is extremely well read, which I think is one of the reasons he is so popular, because he has a lot of depth. In a way, you run into sort of, your comment about academic writers being clunky is entirely correct here. And I say this is someone who's not particularly, I'm not sure about my writing myself, but writing is a sort of difficult activity. Even if you're just sort of writing, a simple persuasive paper, you'd have to make, a claim to I don't know, for someone to do this, just sort of an ad hoc idea I'm coming off the top of my head. But writing is sort of a difficult activity, and you're right about people like Phaser. They are useful, but then this usefulness comes, as you pointed out, the sort of one novel a year guy. This sort of usefulness also has a bugaboo where it's just all just sophistry. So there is extremes here. There is extremes, but I do think of the late. It seems like we have there's sort of the institutions, as we stated on last episode, are sort of fortresses which aren't really allowing ideas out. Actually, they're allowing the worst ideas in a way out, and they're keeping a lot of people out too. So mainstream institutions, I think, to some extent, not to sound like too much like a paleocon, I do think there was a time. Maybe there was a time when certain academic institutions were stronger. Maybe not. I'm unclear about whether there was some quote unquote golden age in the past, but I do think in our current day, certain types of intellectual ideas, libertarians, people going up against certain mandates, should be more Ric Flair-like, because they just don't have anything to lose, quite frankly. I think the mainstream has a lot more to lose here by being like more Ric Flair-like. So that would be my overall comments here. And I think it's first like you have referenced a few Christian debaters here. I think in general they should be more like Ric Flair like, but they have to be more measured also. So for them it's more tricky. But on certain issues, like Robert Malone, like that guy has to go on to go up against that Buccaria guy. I never can say his name. It's the epidemiologist who's been a skeptic, and Scott Atlas. Like, these guys, to me, what they're doing is being, and of course Jones, Hancock, and others, they're going up against a big mainstream. We went over through all the last episode. So that's really my final comment here. I mean, if you're on the outside, I think you should be much more Ric Flair-like, because you got nothing to lose. That's my final comment. TP or Swithin, do you have anything more to add? You could do so, or Swithin could wrap this up. Nice talking to both of you as well.
Yeah, I'll just mention real quickly. I'll just echo your final statement in the sense that, if you're some sort of, if you hold some high office or you're a part of a well-respected institution, if you go on the Joe Rogan podcast and you come out just all guns blazing and you come across like Roddy Piper from They Live, well, then you might have a shot to your reputation. But if you have nothing to lose, or if you're Zizek and you're debating Jordan Peterson on Marxism or something like that, I would say that's where it's fine to shift gears, and you can just be as funny or witty, or if you want to just be as sagacious as you want to, then I think that's fine. Yeah, if you have nothing to lose, and if you have tenure, or if your persona and reputation has already been pre-established, then I would say yes. I mean, you're just feel free to just be yourself. The idea that was mentioned earlier that some of these institutions are sort of retaining some more of their human capital and intellectual capital and sending out the worse or less desirable representatives of the institution out into society. Yeah, I think that's a problem. I mean, it's unfortunate because places like UC Berkeley have this social reputation of being this insufferable leftist institution, and in a way I think that is true. However, I'm sure that Berkeley is staffed by plenty of smart, highly well-read humanities and science professors of all shapes and backgrounds, but unfortunately it's the activistic side of Berkeley that is really the public image that the world knows it by in the present day. And so, what to do about that, I'm not exactly sure. But that's how institutions.
To quick interrupt here.
Sure.
Quick interrupt here. One of the funny things, I think Michael Malice was pointing out on Twitter that they've been shut down for the last 2 years. That a lot of these sort of these hyper liberal, use that word with air quotes, progressive, whatever you want to call it, institutions have been more or less, they've been locked in their dorm rooms, hiding under 6 days a week of testing and quarantine. So there's a sort of irony here that they're sort of that they've been sort of shut down. But although they've went all online and some of it has spilled over in public, but yeah, I mean, they sort of send out, and their cultural capital still exists. Because that's one of the irritating things about, like, I'd say people older than me, boomers and so forth. They still have a high regard for, like, the universities here, like people who have degrees, and people, like, in my opinion, it's almost like if you have a degree, it's almost like how much did you sell out? Not that I say that you shouldn't have a degree, but if you're like you sort of have to explain to me why you're not just some sort of NPC drone in a way. That'd be my retort here. But sorry for interrupting.
No, that's fine, and that's a great point too. I mean, I think what it means to have a degree nowadays is certainly different than it did 30, 40 years ago. I mean, my dad, for example, is a retired psychologist, and I remember early on. I don't know. I mean, we had all sorts of books in the house, and I just remember reading everything from. I remember reading everything from New Yorker magazines to Luftwaffe combat histories to C.S. Lewis, and I guess my point with that is that my dad had a lot of interests, and so did my mom. Literary interests, that is, and there was just so many different things available to sort of read from, in my house and to discuss growing up. I definitely, I think I took that for granted at the time, and then a lot of that came from my dad's studies at his various universities that he attended. And so my impression going into school, then I started college in 2008, and I finished about 6 years afterwards. But my impression going in was that, I'm going to be surrounded by all these people like me who grew up with interesting parents, who have wide ranging interests, and and who are open to a lot of different different politics and philosophies and things like that. But by 2008, I think clown world, as we like to call it, was certainly well on its way. And so that's not those aren't the type of people that I found myself surrounded by. But growing up, I remember being sort of excited by the possibility of getting older and getting more into history, psychology, philosophy, and other things like that. So without carrying on with the rest of my life story, I think I'll cut it there. But thank you again for having me.
Thanks for joining us, NTP. Just with UCL Berkeley, I do think the universities really need to get public debates with sort of charismatic lecturers and professors they can, to really engage and show that they're not just these sort of ideology activist factories, and that they don't just care about their own sort of interests. They're actually interested in ideas and sort of raising sort of the level of discourse, as it were, within society as a whole. And I think that would be laudable thing for the university to do, but as you mentioned before, they've got too much to lose. I mean, this tends to be the case in general. Joe Rogan, back to that, I think it's in the Malone interview, he mentions how back in the day he interviewed Peter Duesberg, and Peter Duesberg was the guy who said that HIV doesn't cause AIDS. He says it was basically all the gays taking poppers and other stuff that basically did in their immune systems. And Rogan said, yeah, we had him on and we tried to find someone to debate him, but nobody would. Literally nobody of any standing would debate Peter Duesberg. And this is one of the problems of trying to get these, is that the establishment simply have too much to lose to bother doing it. I mean, so for instance, I've never come across any major, Pants Down, what's his real name? Ferguson. It'd be interesting. He actually debated a lockdown skeptic at a public forum, but it simply will not happen because he has far too much to lose. So that's what we really want to engender, but I can't see it happening anytime soon. I just now like to thank everyone for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to us on Podbean and YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings, and the more people can access this material. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason, please contact us at mindcrimelibernyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibernyshow@gmail.com.